goes into or is supposed to go into here in the U.S. is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So have you ever noticed, like, in like talks, or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or like, touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like, I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
After the 2024 election, one of the biggest topics of conversation for Democrats was how we would compete in a media environment that is inherently skewed towards the right. And while many suggested that we needed to build our own Joe Rogan, and I agree, we need to invest in left-wing media, but I think doing outreach on programs in which the audience is typically apolitical or a little bit right-leaning is just as important. And that is exactly what we just saw Pete Buttigieg do going on Andrew Schultz's podcast, a comedian I do not like because of his outward support for Trump, but Pete Buttigieg was able to change his mind, and in one moment that we are going to check out, leave him silent, shocked with the lies that Donald Trump has told. We're going to get into it all. But before we do, if I could quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already, and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button. It goes a long way. And it really does mean a lot to me. Now, Pete Buttigieg pointed out a lot of lies on this 3-hour podcast, and we're going to cover them all. But before we get into that moment in which Pete Buttigieg just left everyone silent, I want to start with him calling out the lies of Doge.
Other than dealing with violence and death, the worst part of my job was firing people. Like, I hated it, especially because, like, it wasn't necessarily a bad person, but you had a person who was in a role that they didn't fit in, and their department wasn't doing as well as I thought it needed to do to serve residents. I would have this very painful conversation where we'd sit down, I'd look them in the eye, and that sucked, for obviously most of all for them. But anyway, we were not afraid to do that because you have to do that.
Yeah.
But look at what happened when they came in, right? If this is actually about government efficiency, then the problem you would be solving, which is a real problem, is that in the federal government, it is too hard to reward your top performers. So you could be somebody who could be commanding a multi-million-dollar salary in the private sector, working on something wildly important, but there's just no way that you're getting, you're in your particular pay grade, same as everybody else. And to remove your bottom performance. Like, a lot of people who've been in and out of business and government will tell me, like, when I was in the private sector and the public sector, actually, like, the top 10% were pretty much the same, these amazing driven people. The government ones weren't compensated as well, but they were purpose driven. But the bottom 10% was completely different because I couldn't do anything about the bottom 10%. Right? So imagine if Doge had come in and they had gone through every department and said, okay, we're going to create a way to reward the top performers. And we're also going to analyze either whose job description is no longer needed, or their job performance is not there. And even though it's painful, even though maybe it's politically tough, like, we're going to show them the door. That would be one thing. But they just sent an email to everybody. Many of whom were, in fact, top performers. Like, some of the people they fired who got caught up in this thing, people got fired just based on whether you were in a category called probationary employee. But to be clear, probationary isn't like you fucked up and you're on probation.
Yeah, you could start.
You could actually be because you were promoted. You could be a 7-year veteran at the FAA, or maybe you'd been there as a contractor, but you were so good that the FAA said, we want to hire you now as a government employee. And even though it might have been a little pay cut, you went for it. And you're probationary. And then next thing you know, like, you wake up one day and this office, department, whatever Doge is, clearly hasn't, like, gone through and checked, like, who's doing a good job or there's no way, because there wasn't even time to do that. And they're just like, guess what?
I don't really know how much more commentary I can offer up, because Pete is doing it all himself. He is the best messenger in the Democratic Party, and he's demonstrating what other elected officials need to do. Go into these spaces, have long-form conversations, and change the minds of easily influenced audiences. And Pete is clearly doing that, not just talking about the very clear lies that Elon Musk is pushing with Doge, which everyone can get on board with, pushing back against. We don't want to see dark money run our politics. That is not a conservative or liberal, even though it's, a much more democratic position. But Pete continued to kind of make that apolitical argument that everyone can understand when he was talking about Trump not bringing back manufacturing right here. there.
I grew up in South Bend, Indiana. People think South Bend, they know Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, yeah.
The big employer that propelled South Bend wasn't Notre Dame, it was Studebaker. Studebaker made cars. It was before the big three, it was the big four. And we were one of them. It dominated our city, grew our city. And then in 1963, they shut down. That's 20 years before I was born, and we were still dealing with it 20 years later. We were still dealing with it 50 years later when I became the mayor there at the age of 29. And what had happened was, I mean, when we were going to school, I would go in between just acres of collapsing factories that literally looked like a war zone. I have been to war zones that look very similar to the way a lot of places in the industrial Midwest, like where I grew up, looked because of some of these things you're talking about. Right. Which is why I think there's an appeal to saying, we're going to bring back manufacturing, right? And by the way, again, I don't want to like move away from what I was saying that we shouldn't go back to where we were, because I think a lot needs to change. But I would point out that in our entire lifetime, the year when there was the most investment in factories in the United States, the most factories being built, was last year. Because there were a lot of policies, the chip stuff, the manufacturing stuff, trying to get more of the green economy stuff to be built on U.S. soil, that led to a lot of these factories. Now, a lot of them are still in construction as we speak. Some of them actually opened, some of them still haven't. But right now, in Kokomo, Indiana, I just read a story today about 370 workers at Stellantis who just got laid off. Auto workers who got laid off because of the tariffs. So this is a tool that you can use for sure. But it's absolutely critically important that you know what you're doing when you do. And if you're just making shit up as you go along, or if you're doing it for a reason that's actually less about helping middle America and more about consolidating power, which is what I think is actually happening. We can get into that.
Now that clip was first shared by Andrew Schultz's podcast own account, right? So the podcast as their little teaser clip for the episode shared that last night on Twitter. And I got excited because Pete Buttigieg was going to be talking for 3 hours on a podcast that's always great. But what made me especially excited were the comments, conservatives, blue check, Twitter, people, X, whatever you want to call it. It's not X. I'm not going to listen to whatever Elon says, but saying it doesn't matter how you feel about politics. Pete Buttigieg is real. Doesn't matter if you like his positions or not. Pete Buttigieg is honest. I don't care if you dislike the Biden administration. Pete Buttigieg is the man. I love this story from conservatives with people with, MAGA in their profile, because Pete is authentic, because he is real, because he's telling a personal story that is compelling to all of us about love, about his life, about his fight, about his own struggle to embrace freedoms that we all deserve to be with, who we want to be with, to love the way we want to love, to enjoy what this country should be about, which is free expression. Something Donald Trump has suppressed, something Republicans claim to care about, making comedy legal again, legalizing free speech. All these nonsense talking points, they say, while they're arresting college students, shipping them to Louisiana without any notice, picked up by mass thugs. What for? Writing an op-ed for peacefully protesting. That's not free speech, and that's not even political. That's just right and wrong, and that's how we have to communicate this. It's exactly what Pete Buttigieg is doing. And he continued, when he just plainly said, Republicans don't have the answers for you.
Right around the time I came out, right?
This was after you got back from Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. When you get deployed, they tell you to write a letter. I still have it in a drawer somewhere. It just says just in case on the outside.
Wow.
And it's everything from that you want your loved ones to know, from your internet passwords to like how you feel your life went. So I got deployed while I was in office, and I just took a leave, stopped being mayor, started being a lieutenant, and went into my other job, basically. I was a sitting mayor of my hometown. I had a beautiful house. I had good friends. I had like a good life. And that was part of what I wrote about in that letter. But in the back of my head, I'm thinking, all right, but I'm a grown-ass man, and I don't actually know what it's like to be in love. And if I get back, I'm not going to let that continue. Like, whatever the implications, I'd rather deal with that than once again contemplate the idea that I could go to my grave not knowing what it's like to be.
I said it earlier in this video, and maybe I'm breaking my own promise, but I just don't have much more commentary on it than that Pet is so spot on in the way he is able to communicate this in a much more relaxed setting. This isn't a policy paper. This isn't some big grand speech is exactly what we need. Now, we saw Charlie Kirk say this on Gavin Newsom's podcast. Maybe a podcast I'm not that much of a fan on, considering something that Gavin has said, and he said that podcasting is masculine because you have to go into the lion's den and fight it out, and Democrats can't do that because we're so weak now. That's nonsensical. I don't think there's anything super manly about grabbing a microphone and spouting off. Not to say that this show isn't positive, but I do think there's some little bit of truth in the fact that Democrats do need to be more comfortable having long-form conversations, being honest with people. Donald Trump did that, had those long-form conversations, but he lied, right? But because he just spoke and rambled, people thought it was kind of true, and it wasn't. We need to be able to combat that. We need to go to spaces which we would normally maybe not want to be a part of, but recognize that that's where the audiences that we most need to reach are, and we're able to communicate the messages that matter most, like Buttigieg did right here.
Goes into, or is supposed to go into, here in the U.S., is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So, have you ever noticed, like, in like talks, or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or like, touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like, I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
That thing would suck.
That is like all of the design, the manufacturing, supply chains. That's the kind of thing that corporations can do very well, and Apple did it very well, and their competitors. But what makes the iPhone work? Well, among other things, the internet. The internet was literally invented by a federal research project. And it would never have been possible to invent the internet with a private company, because you wouldn't have got the kind of capital return, even though it's $1 trillion idea or a multi-trillion dollar idea. You know, companies can do multi-billion dollar ideas, but $1 trillion idea, like inventing the internet, that requires basic research. And that's the kind of thing the government's supposed to do, among many other things.
It requires basic research? What is that?
Yeah, by basic research, I mean things that are so fundamental that you actually don't know for 50 or 100 years if they're going to have a return. They might never work out.
Oh, right? Yeah. You can't look at it as this thing is going to be profitable. It has to be
So it's different
benevolent
from
endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting that there's going to be a
return in the next 10, 20 years.
Right, at least kind of within the kind of profit rate.
But public parks is another version of this and stuff like that.
Yeah,
you can't privatize the public park.
Right. This is the whole idea of public goods. Right? This is why we have governments, why we collect taxes.
God, we're turning into such libs already, dude.
But there's a handshake, right? There are the things that only the government can do, and then there are the things that the private sector can and should do, and they meet in the middle. But if you start shorting, and part of what really worries me right now about this kind of war on academia, and there are some things about academia that need to change, but the war on academia, the cuts to cancer research, the cuts to science research, this kind of like general anti-science like atmosphere that I think is emanating from the administration, like that costs us in ways that don't show up on a corporate profit and loss statement 6 months from now or a year from now. But in terms of whether a country, a society, an economy is productive and is growing and is innovating, that starts to really cost you over time. And if we're shorting that, or if corporations and extremely wealthy people don't want to be paying into that through taxes, that is, I think, a classic example of a kind of short-term gain that causes long-term pain.
This is one of the best conversations I have ever seen, not because of Andrew Schultz or any of his guys, but the way that Pete Buttigieg understands the audience he is speaking to and is able to make the points in a way that makes sense to the arguments they claim to care about. Pete is the best at this. If anyone wants to go out there and speak, sit down, watch this 3 hours. If you were a Democratic elected official and trying to figure out like the manosphere, it's not about acting tough or like throwing in a zin or, I don't know, hitting a parlay before. It's about understanding where people are coming from and trying to reach them that way. Pete is the best at that and will continue to be, and we're always going to uplift him on this show. And if you want to support that, as always, you can hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and if you stuck around at the end, drop a blue heart in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.